Welcome to the Well-Seasoned Librarian podcast. This is season 15, episode 8. I'm your host, Dean Jones. I want to thank you for returning to the podcast after such a long hiatus that I've had. I was very ill and not able to do the podcast for a month, so thank you for sticking with me. Today we're talking with Toni Tipton-Martin, who is a renowned food and nutrition journalist dedicated to promoting healthier communities. She has received numerous accolades, including the Julia Child Foundation Award, multiple James Beard Book Awards, and an IACP honors. Her work has been featured in prestigious publications and on national television. As a prolific author, Tipton-Martin has written several influential books celebrating African American culinary history, such as Jubilee and the Jemima Code. She is also the founder of the Sunday Youth Project, a nonprofit organization focused on combating childhood hunger and promoting healthy eating habits. Today we're talking with her about the new book, When Southern Women Cook, History, Lore, and 300 Recipes, with contributions from 70 women writers, out now. Let me take you to my conversation with Toni Tipton-Martin. Welcome to the Well-Seasoned Librarian podcast. Today I'm speaking with food writer Toni Tipton-Martin, author of When Southern Women Cook, out on the 12th. Toni, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
I want to talk to you about the cookbook that you have coming out today. What inspired you to create a cookbook that focuses on the contributions of Southern women in culinary history? How did you collaborate with Morgan Malling to bring this vision to life?
Oh, well, what a big question. The work was motivated because of my natural determination to tell the stories of marginalized cooks in America. I spent most of my career focused on African American cooks. And because of some experiences that I had in learning more and more about Southern food history, it became quite natural that Southern women would also need to have broader stories told about them. And Morgan and I worked together at America's Test Kitchen for Cook's Country magazine. She had an interesting passion for women as well. She works at a women's shelter. And during our weekly one-on-ones, she used to talk about her desire to do something to help uplift those women. And so there was just this really great convergence between us, her deep and rich understanding of recipe development through the Cook's Country lens, and my passion for storytelling and history. They just came together really nicely into this form of this book.
I want to really let the listeners know this is a cookbook, obviously, but it is more than that. I mean, there's so much more to this, and there's a lot of different stories in it and histories. How did you select the diverse range of women featured in the book? What role did their personal stories play in shaping the narrative and the recipes?
Well, initially, the group of women were selected based on conversations I've had for years with Southern women. So I knew that there were stories to be told, concerns that were being expressed, but we wanted there to be an even greater diversity of women. And so we engaged Casey Highsmith, who is a PhD who did her work in women's history. And she had her fingers on the pulse of the modern current women that are functioning in the Southern food space, whether they were farmers or restaurateurs or chefs or um, any number of other careers. And so between the three of us, Morgan, through her lens, my group of historical people that I've known for years, and Casey's um, understanding of the New South, we were able to assemble a list that really is short. I mean, we had the book publishes with just 70 writers,
Right.
but there are so many more. We could have volumes 2 and 3 and still have more to say.
Now, I want to ask too, how did you balance the rich history of Southern cooking with modern culinary techniques and ingredients? What are some of the examples of recipes that bridge the gap between tradition and modern innovation?
Well, I think what we have to remember is that we are a nation of immigrants, and all recipes in this country began with a set of formulas that, came in original cookbooks and with all of the people who migrated here. And through the years, those recipes were developed, interpreted, reworked, adapted according to interactions with other communities, with whatever foodstuffs were available in the local community, so that a simple recipe for something like cornmeal and water, which is known as a hoe cake. We start the book with hoe cakes because of its simplicity. It's just cornmeal and water. But as that dish migrates, as people have opportunity to add more things to it, to change it, to develop it, it has become cornbread, spoon bread, cornbread dressing. And now in the modern time, with more communities coming from all parts of the globe, we can do things like add a cardamom butter to represent Indian culture.
Ooh.
Or we're learning about the ways that the Lumbee Indians make a sandwich using cornbread, a type of cornbread, as the bread surrounding collard greens. So it really wasn't that much work for us. We didn't have to overthink or even I don't know, there's a concern that people appropriate in a way that's not accurate to the culture. But we wanted the people who represent a culture to speak on behalf of their own adaptations and their food. And that's what we've accomplished here by modernizing some very familiar dishes.
We were talking earlier before we recorded about research, and I wanted to ask about who, if you can tell us about some of the lesser known Southern women chefs and culinary pioneers you uncovered during your research. What did their contributions do to shape the cuisine that we know today?
Oh, there are just so many fun stories that are told in this book. One of my favorites that I cite all of the time, which isn't necessarily about a recipe, but it is about entrepreneurship. And that's another important variable for people to be aware, that food was a way for women to gain their economic independence. And that's, again, tied to what Morgan was interested in. So I like to talk about the woman who is responsible for the red wax drip on the Maker's Mark bottle.
Oh, wow.
Right. It's such a fun story to tell, right? That here is this wife of a distiller, and she has seen his product on the shelves in the store, and his bottles look like everybody else's bottles. And so she goes to him with this idea, and behold, we get a wax strip on Maker's Mark, and it's what makes that bottle iconic and that brand so well known. And that's just one of the kinds of stories that we tell.
I like to talk about with my guests how like people assume certain things about regions of America, but the South is not a monolith. How does this book explore the diverse regional flavors of the American South? What are some of the unique regional dishes and techniques that you highlight?
Well, you could take something as simple as fried chicken.
Yeah.
And fried chicken, the archives at America's Test Kitchen Cooks Country are vast with fried chicken recipes. It's a Southern icon. But you could trace the history of fried chicken across the Southern states, whether you're talking about the far-reaching states of Florida and Texas, or as far north as what we call the Upper South, reaching into the Mason-Dixon line. We have a North Carolina dipped fried chicken, which is also present in New Orleans. There is a way of batter dipping the fried chicken there. So fried chicken helps us see the region and its multiple influences.
Okay, how does food reflect the social and cultural history of the South? What are some examples of recipes that have deep cultural significance?
Well, let's take something like the pound cake. Pound cake at its beginning was just a very dense recipe that relied on farm goods at a time when there was no leavening, right? And so you whipped a lot of eggs into this recipe and you came up with a really wonderful treat. That item is pervasive in Southern culture. You can see it on restaurant menus. You can see it, we talk about it as an item inside of a shoebox lunch, which is something that civil rights workers used to feed themselves throughout the 60s when they were fighting for voting rights and other rights. And they weren't able to stop along the road and eat because of Jim Crow segregation. So the pound cake is a source of nourishment for them. So in addition to its initial celebratory role, we also have it playing out there. We have a woman named Georgia Gilmore, who also during the 60s created a organization that helped raise money for the civil rights workers, and pound cake was one of the dishes that they sold. And so it's interesting to see the ways, again, that women have used particular iconic foods for social change, but also for improvement of their lives.
What role can cookbooks like When Southern Women Cook play in preserving Southern culinary traditions and for future generations? How can we ensure that these traditions continue to evolve and thrive?
Well, one of my favorite stories, and Morgan would be the advocate for it if she were here, so I'll speak on her behalf, is the section on barbecue. And now most people don't think about women in relation to the barbecue culture. Because we're talking about whole animals, large cuts of meat, standing over a dusty, smoky flame for hours on end. We tend to talk about women's relationship to barbecue as the people who are providing the side dishes
Yeah.
and making sure that there's a bounty of foods to eat at the picnic. But Morgan is passionate about barbecue, and to the point that she hosts a hog roast in Massachusetts for her friends. And
Wow.
so we have made sure to turn an eye on the women who are what we're calling pit mistresses, or right. There are women who are masters of the pit, and there aren't a lot of them. But
Yeah.
hopefully over time, a book like this will inspire more people to participate in ways that they haven't before. And this could be the kernel that sparks that interest.
I want to talk also about how the cookbook addresses issues of food justice as an equity in the South. What are some of the ways to make Southern cuisine more accessible and inclusive?
Well, I think that a book like this, generally speaking, makes the food more accessible because on every page there is a story about a different type of woman, right? So these aren't stories that are going to fit neatly in anyone's expectation. I asked each one of the contributors to recall the stories that we shared over the years, for those that I was in connection with, um, and then decide if that was the level of intimacy they wanted to share, if that was the area of expertise they wanted to be known for. And we allowed for multiple voices in this book. So we have some scholarly pieces that are strict, basic information about the background of white lily flower versus Martha White flower. We have some more personal stories written by people like Vivian Howard, who talk about what it's like to operate a restaurant in a man's world. We have Virginia Willis talking about the intimacy of the weight struggle, that a woman in the South was supposed to be fragile and thin and needed protection, right? And a heavy, buxom woman struggling with her weight while baking biscuits constantly as your business, of course she's going to have, weight issues. And so Virginia explores the conundrum of this stereotype of expectation for women to function in a particular way against the reality that they're in the food business, and they're selling things like biscuits and pound cake.
I personally grew up with two grandmothers who taught me how to cook, and they both were from different parts of the South. So they had really different techniques and ways of cooking, and they were able to teach me quite a bit. And it marks my cooking to this day, even though I've expanded and done other regions and different types of cooking. How about you? Did you grow up cooking in the Southern tradition? Did you grow up with anybody who influenced you that cooked from the South?
I did grow up with women who were influential, and their Southern influence varied. As I say in my first book, The Jemima Code, in the very first opening lines of my intro, I say that when my parents left the South, they left skid marks,
Yeah.
because they were trying to escape the segregation and oppression of a racially divided community. And what that meant for me was that there wasn't a lot of talk in our household about Southernness and Southern icons and Southern banners. We just ate the food that they prepared. So
Yeah.
there was cornbread on the table. There were delicious light hot rolls. There was fried chicken. There were collard greens and all of those things that are Southern, have Southern labels. But my mother's a vegetarian.
Oh, wow.
And so we grew up with an urban garden in our backyard. She had avocado trees and all kinds of stone fruits. And so fresh food. So foods of all type were served at our table. Southern California is heavily influenced by Mexican culture.
Yes.
And so we have a lot of dishes that have Southwestern flavors in them. And my grandmother was a chef at a hotel in Los Angeles, but we never talked about her role as a chef or used that word because
Right.
that wasn't the language of the time. And what that said to me over time is what that said to me as I learned more about the food world is that somehow in my community, there was this perception that the women who were doing the cooking weren't as elite as a French classically trained male chef, because we never called her that, right? She
Yeah.
was a cook. And it wasn't until many years later that we were able to extract stories from her that she could be proud of, because otherwise it was just service work. And I think that was a residual uh, of that Southern upbringing. So there's some positives and negatives associated with my Southern experience, which was why I wanted to tell um, a more inclusive story.
As with any cookbook, there's always a research process, and ones that are dealing with some context of history or biography, there's a lot of research involved. How did you approach the process of developing and testing the recipes for the book? What were some of the challenges and rewards of the process and the research?
I love that question. So, America's Test Kitchen has a vast archive of recipes. And our first step was for Morgan with her recipe development skills to comb that archive and just get a baseline of how many Southern recipes we had in our possession. And that number exceeded 600 recipes. At that point, we went through a process of determining which ones were the most accurate, because obviously over that time, there was a lot of adaptation for accessibility, which is what we're known for, is making recipes that are fail proof, which means you can sometimes leave out essential cultural elements because you're trying to make sure that it's available to everyone with a, standard American pantry, and they might not have unusual ingredients. So these recipes were created before the COVID period, when people started ordering food online, and it became much more natural to just order an ingredient if you don't have it.
Yeah.
So once she culled this archive down to a reasonable number of recipes that we thought we could promote, then we started looking for those that had a womanish background, is what I started to call it. And we just, you do a quick search and find out if there's any kind of woman's history. And that was another way to eliminate those. And then finally, we added in the storytellers that would be either local experts, people who had that cultural experience, but we wanted someone else to tell the stories of these recipes through their perspective, not ours as a recipe media company. And so we, again, engaged Southern food experts, most all of them from the region. So we wanted to also narrow in and make sure that we weren't asking outside people to speak on behalf of the region. So we have some pretty broad but specific boundaries for the writers as well.
Looking at the book, it's no surprise, it being published by American's Test Kitchen, that it's a gorgeous cookbook. It's very beautiful to look at. And also, I've had it by my bedside for a couple of weeks, and I've been reading it at my leisure, and planning on using some of the recipes and kind of looking at what I want to cook. And I'm going to actually cook something from it today. So it's not something you just put on the shelf and use at leisure. It's something that you can really kind of read and enjoy. What was some of the process that you went in through in developing it? Were you able to articulate your vision to the people that were helping you produce it?
Well, fortunately for me, I happen to have two award-winning books, which speak to what you're talking about, right? That it is possible to have a beautiful, compelling recipe book with recipes that work, right? Because that's also a problem. All recipe books don't necessarily have recipes that you can recreate.
Yeah.
Um, and but also that are interesting and compelling to read. And I basically have a formula now, a formula for attributing origin stories and making sure that sources are identified, which is completely an expression of my journalistic background. I am a journalist. I'm not a scholar. I'm not a chef, and I'm not a registered dietitian. Those are important labels and career paths that I touch on in my career, but I am not one of those. I am a journalist.
Right.
And so I was able to use my book, Jubilee, I think, as a unspoken model for what we could create here for Southern women, for telling Southern women stories. And I'm really happy to see that in the books that are starting to come out, there is even more of this style happening in the publishing world, that people are beginning to understand the importance of attributing your ideas to their original source. There is no there is no original recipe. All recipes derive from some other idea. And we could both have a recipe, and I could add currants and you could have raisins, but we'd still be making essentially the same thing.
Yeah.
And so recipe adaptation is an important marker of accuracy to speak to a certain time and a certain community. And we wanted to make sure that everyone who had touched a dish in the most prominent way was recognized in this book, but that it's also a book you want to cook from and you love cooking from it.
Jumping off of that question, I want to ask you personally. I mean, when you got your first copy of the book and were able to look at it, how did you feel about it?
Oh, there's no comparison to that moment, even when you have been reading it on page proof for weeks. And we had been reading it on screens, on printouts. But once you hold it in your hands, you'll be able to see there is a video of us when we were unboxing them. And Morgan in particular intentionally did not look in the box for the whole week that it sat on the desk in the office. She just passed it by, and people were going by her desk talking about, oh, it's so beautiful. Oh, it's so smart. And she was just like, okay, I'm not looking. I'm not looking. Like, she really wanted that authentic moment. And you can see in that video that both of us, for different reasons, are holding it close to our hearts, because it's like having a baby.
Yeah.
You've put so much effort into the creation of this, and so much time and energy and emotion, that you can't help but feel a love and attachment to it. And that comes through with both of us in that unboxing video. It's a feeling that never goes away, no matter how many books you publish. They're all very special, like your children. And a different type of energy has gone into each one. I am not a, I'm not, I don't have a lot of stories published in this book intentionally.
Yeah.
I wrote the introduction, and I've written some of the pieces where an idea is a little nuanced and unique to my way of thinking. I have this peculiar hybrid way of approaching a story in that I'm a journalist, as I said, and I'm not a trained scholar, but I have learned to do a lot of research in the way that I would be looking for interviews, right, as a
Right.
journalist.
Yeah.
And so I sometimes see stories coming together in ways that other people just don't see. And the intro to the sandwich chapter is a really good example of that. It's a way that we thought we could tell the story of the history of sandwich making in the South, because there's so many diverse sandwiches, muffalettas, po' boys, catfish sandwiches. The list goes on and on, fried chicken sandwiches. But I kept seeing something else in the history of women and sandwiches. And I wasn't sure that I could expect realistically for someone else to see these 3 or 4 points that I wanted to merge into 700 short words. And so I jumped in and I wrote it, and I'm glad that I did, because we were able to tell a very dense story in just a few words.
We touched on your books, Jubilee and the Jemima Code, and now you have When Southern Women Cook coming out today. What are some of the future plans you have, or do you have plans yet for future works?
Oh, I always have future plans. When I wrote the Jemima Code, I envisioned a 7-book series.
Oh, nice. Wow.
Yeah, so I'm working on the next book in the series, which is a dessert book. And if all things go well, it'll publish next winter.
Nice. Exciting.
Yeah, so this will also be, as with all of my other books, it will be a combination of historical figures, important historical information, and amazing recipes that spring from my sweet tooth.
Very nice. That sounds exciting. Toni, I want to thank you for being on the podcast today. We're going to have links to When Southern Women Cook on the bio so people can purchase it. It's going to be out today. Also, we're going to have links for Jubilee and the Jemima Code in the bio as well, so you can purchase those also. You're going to want to get those. Also, Toni, I want to thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great.
That's all the time we have left on the Well-Seasoned Librarian podcast. That was my conversation with author Toni Tipton-Martin, who along with Morgan Balling wrote the wonderful When Southern Women Cook, History, Lore, and 300 Recipes with contributions from 70 women writers. We have links in the bio to purchase this book, and you can get it at all better bookstores. We look forward to being back this week with more author interviews. Until then, I'll see you at the library.